All right, so in our second session, we have our next two speakers. The first is Paul Bogaard, the chief editor of the first volume of the critical edition of Whitehead. Paul retired from teaching after 40 years at Mount Allison University, having published in the philosophy of chemistry, history of science in Canada, ancient philosophy, and local history in the Maritimes in Canada. He's a founding director of the Tantramar, did I get that right? Tantramar Heritage Trust, the Sackville Waterfowl Park, the Cape Nature Center, and the UNESCO designated Fundy Biosphere Reserve. And we are so very glad that he not only initially said, yes, I'll help with Bell, and every few years we said, could you also do the Hawking, and could you also do the Heath? So join me in welcoming Paul.
So mirroring Brian's last comments, this is my first best opportunity to acknowledge Jason. Are you somewhere else, Jason?
Oh, he's out in the hall.
I'll whisper to you that in Jason's absence, as actually we were just kibitzing about this, Jason's the fellow who discovered the Bell manuscripts, which had lain quietly in my home university archives for decades. We knew of Bell. We knew that he had left us stuff because his books were allowed to come through and were sitting there on the shelf. And we were already mystified by Whitehead Connections and Husserl Connections, opened a book in our own little library, and out falls a postcard from Husserl written to Bell while he was in prison during World War I. Mysteries. So what's going on with Bell stuff is left to Mount Allison in the 60s when he dies. But as Jason has written, I've got some of it in my introduction, as George has done a couple of times in most amusing ways, Bell, at the end of World War I, becomes a British spy and stops his academic career after some years at Harvard. And though his papers come to Mount Allison, his alma mater, and the family's cherished heirloom in higher education, the fact is the spy business clamped the papers. Despite the fact that they were philosophy and not political, they were clamped until the 90s and early 2000s. So it was really only a very few years that they had emerged, that an archivist had written them up. Thankfully, it was a digital age. Thankfully, Jason is digital and discovered there's some stuff there. I think it was his dissertation you went after first, which he'd written under Husserl, been denied because of the war, been reinstated. It's quite a story. But that's the cover for my embarrassment, that I'm living with these lecture notes sitting, 50 feet away, 50 yards away, for decades smoldering, and I didn't know about it. Of course, if I had known about it in my mid-career, what would I have done then? At least in retirement, this was a safe project. So, thank you, Jason, and thank you to George and Brian for welcoming him on board as this became a critical edition. Thank you to the reviewers who said, critical edition's great, boy, that's got to be volume 1.
Yeah.
That means I'm done with my part.
Right.
So I'm grateful to all
Back
these
to mowing the
people.
lawn.
Exactly. Well, another waterfall park, something environmental. That's what
Yes, there you go.
a lot of my life has been. So with that intro, I'm going to skip 5 pages or so because I've lost the time to do that. As reminders to some of you and as an alert and help for a number of you in the audience. Lovely to see you all today. The reason for my topic is really motivated by the situation of 1924-25. The word organism and the word evolution, biological concepts after all for a mathematical physicist, appear very few times. 2 or 3 times in the inquiry. And a couple of his pre-Harvard works doesn't appear at all. So he's clearly not thinking about these biological concepts. Soon as these lectures get started, he's already announcing that biological concepts are going to be important to us. And if we leap forward for a little bit, every Whiteheadian knows that Process and Reality starts off. I mean, it's literally the first paragraph, the first page in the preface of Process and Reality. It says this is going to be a philosophy of organism. And as George pointed out years ago, and despite your mea culpa, George, I still agree with your assessment, in the 80s, that for all of his later published work, the notion of evolution for a guy with Whitehead's kind of process studies kind of mindset, there's very little play on evolution whatsoever. So big surprise when suddenly biological concepts emerge here right in this key place and key time. And even more surprising, it's not philosophy of organism that he announces, it's philosophy of evolution. That caught my attention. So it's both, how does this arise? Can we make anything of this? Because we only have so much. Is George is right, after the lectures, this largely disappears. I mean, it fades into something said in Science in the Modern World, but it depends a little bit on how you read that. He talks about this evolutionary expansiveness, that's a nice phrase, and he talks about a philosophy of the evolution of organisms. So it's almost as if he's one step towards a philosophy of organism, but has 1 foot back in a philosophy of evolution. Which foot are you standing on here? Clearly by PR, he's standing on organisms, and what can we make of this blip along the way? Are there any things interesting here? And I'm really grateful to Dennis for agreeing with me that there's some interesting stuff here. I'm not the only one that noticed this coming through. So I will turn to my text now and behave myself. Well, Whitehead's drawn in 1924 to a consideration of biological concepts, and that begs the question, what prompted this? From whom is he getting this? He clearly hadn't been a student of biology in the literal sense. Victor Lowe tells us that the inaugural lecture was met with the charge that it was merely Bergsonian, and in the lectures that follow, Whitehead did assign to his students reading from Creative Evolution, especially chapter 4. He also assigned readings from Lord Morgan's Emergent Evolution, well-known book in its day, much more recent, and acknowledges his influence amongst others. So these two guys are obvious, and their works are obvious candidates for a kind of prompting here. One might also credit his decades-long acquaintance with Darcy Thompson, a friendship they established when they were students together already at Trinity College, Cambridge. Whitehead tells us, after all, in his autobiographical comments provided for the Schilp volume dedicated to him in 1941, how much he had learned through these various friendships, accounting for much of his education, including his knowing Kant as well as he did when he was a student at Cambridge, because he says he only ever took courses in math. He even mentions a friendship with William Bateson, who had been a neighbor while living, for those who talked about his living in Grantchester, he was a neighbor in Grantchester just at the time Bateson was becoming famous in genetics. He mentions the Aristotelian Society, that occurs in the teens, a little bit later, and then there is his well-known friendship with Lord Haldane, not himself steeped in the life sciences, but his brother was, and Dennis is going to make reference to this. And Jack Haldane, who is Lord Haldane's nephew, is mentioned in the lectures as another source to be read. He actually assigns it to his students. And then finally, there is L.J. Henderson, a name I had not been familiar with before coming to this particular editing task. And clearly Whitehead is directly crediting him, and I'm going to be arguing here that he was the one that was particularly relevant to these lectures. So let me just go through this a bit more carefully. Through these friendships, such as these, Whitehead was clearly aware of how far biology had come in the preceding 70 years. During those decades, a rich field of theoretical concepts had arisen from what had otherwise been for so long a merely observational field. Darcy Thompson had actually been in contact with Darwin. discussions about natural selection had, in the later decades of the 1800s, become commonplace, while contentious, and had come to be melded into the emerging field of genetics in the hands of pioneer scientists like Bateson and the Haldings. Darwin's conception of evolution had already been folded into broader philosophical stands by others. Spencer would be a good example, and he talks about Spencer, Bergson, Lord Morgan. Whitehead knew and studied their writings. Bergson, he had entertained his own. So he knew these folks. He kind of knew those topics. So that this lifelong mathematical physicist with no formal training in biology was well aware of the conceptual array made available from the life sciences should not be surprising. From whom he may have drawn his key inspirations for what appears in these lectures may prove more difficult to determine, and especially since, as George had pointed out in the 80s, the concept of evolution seems a little evident in Whitehead's own writings, except it would seem for these lectures. Whitehead acknowledges openly that he is not the first to impress concepts from biology upon philosophy. The debates prompted by Darwin's theory of evolution had always been at least partly philosophical debates, religious debates. Spencer is cited in these Harvard lectures, and Whitehead is comfortable enough within those debates already about natural selection to criticize those like Spencer who narrowed their conception of evolution to competition. He's the guy who coins the phrase survival of fittest, not Darwin, but Spencer.
The bulldog of Darwin.
Exactly. Well, there's another one earlier than that too. Two bulldogs, I guess. And he acknowledges the encouragement he had drawn from Lord Morgan's emergent evolution, which I just mentioned minutes ago. However, the similarities of their metaphysical stances is much more evident in what each says about emergence on new levels within reality than one finds about the process of evolution. So it may be emergent evolution, but he's leaning on the emergent thing there. He's not really drawing so much inspiration about evolution from there. Turning to Bergson's creative evolution, Whitehead assigned to his students, they would have found explicit criticism of the mechanistic illusion. That's Bergson's phrase. Whitehead also acknowledges he owed much to Bergson's emphasis on duration and on his sense of the creativity needed to account for the continuity of life and the discontinuity of evolution's products. But I would suggest, much as I've said about Lord Morgan, while there was a common purpose in constructing each their broad views of the natural order within the frame of evolution, there is not so much in either of these sources that delineates what evolution permits or implies in any detailed sense, even when he does so in these lectures. It may be that Whitehead shared with Russell some of his resistance to Bergson's insisting upon the primary role of intuition. That's the one that Bertie always criticized. And in any case, I find myself aligning with Victor Lowe's warning that the influence of Bergson, especially in the positions Whitehead takes up at this point, has been much overrated. So, for a more nuanced sense of how those are the other alternatives that I'm essentially setting aside, I think we need to turn to L.G. Henderson. Henderson is quite explicitly the source that Whitehead credits when in mid-December, his lectures turn to what can be drawn from these biological concepts. The environment gives its contribution. This comes out of L.J. Henderson's two books. You've read the titles. Each organism, to some extent, creates its environment. That was actually quite an extraordinary and relatively novel claim in those decades. I'll come back to that point. The fitness of the environment had been Henderson's way of grabbing attention because it was so unexpected in his new field. His field so new that it wasn't even being called biochemistry yet. But that was his field at Harvard. It's not just that organisms evolve by becoming more fit in the seemingly static environment they find themselves in. They do, of course, but not without influencing that environment in the process. Environments evolve along with organisms, and insofar as the environment is comprised of other organisms, as well as its inorganic background, we are very close here to insights debated amongst evolutionary biologists and philosophers of biology in the 90s and 2000s. This has been a hot area of debate in philosophy of biology. We've come to recognize mutualism as well as competition. We have come to appreciate that much of evolution is co-evolution. And Henderson, along with Whitehead, was wading into these interesting conceptual thickets 80 years earlier. Although Henderson knew of Whitehead and apparently had a role to play, this comes out of Lowe, in Harvard's invitation to Whitehead to come there for a position, presumably they only met after Whitehead had crossed the Atlantic. I don't know that for sure, but there's no other evidence that I know of that they had met each other before. I don't even know if he knew of Henderson's works prior to that. It may have something to do with why they arrive in the summer, and this starts to come out in December. It doesn't come out in the September lectures, but he's had a time to meet him and for there to start to be some build-up. They did become friends with Whitehead's interest in what can be made from these key concepts in biology, and Henderson interested himself in the implications between scientific fields and with philosophy. He was taking seminars from Royce. He was part of Harvard's Royce Club. They must have had much to discuss, and for Whitehead, at a most fruitful period. Whitehead seems to read Henderson's Fitness of the Environment, which was published 10 years earlier. They incidentally had been presented as Henderson's own little lecture series at Harvard before they were published. And Order of Nature had been published in 1917. But it may be that he had not even read these until they met at Harvard Square. Henderson had started with math and physics. Sounds familiar? When he studied at Harvard College, before turning to physical chemistry and then what they called in his day biological chemistry. He may have even attended some Royce seminars. After time at the University of Strasbourg, Henderson returned to Harvard by 1904, had become full professor by 1919. So while Henderson is younger than Whitehead by 16 years, Henderson was well beyond simply being a junior colleague, the way in many respects Bell was. Whitehead and Henderson shared a keen interest in the advantages of broader education. Henderson, from his own vantage point, had even taught courses in the history of science. They both worked closely on projects like the formation of a society of junior fellows at Harvard. Henderson had indicated it was institutions like Trinity College and Cambridge that served as the model for the fellows at Harvard. Later in their years together at Harvard, in 1934, Henderson was given an honorary degree by Cambridge. That was his first honorary degree. So these bits and pieces, I acknowledge, are, at best supposition and surmise, but there can be little doubt of the influence, or at least the reassurances provided by what there's a memoir written about Henderson after he dies in 1943 by the National Academy of Sciences that has a series of biographical memoirs. And in that memoir, that author says it has one of the major achievements here was Henderson's thoughtful consideration of the relations of organisms to their surroundings. That's the theme that's going to be replayed here. That Henderson proposed the environment itself was particularly fit for living organisms and their evolution did not mean that some sort of inorganic natural selection was at work, but that elements upon which he focused, particularly the principal components of what were then understood as organic compounds, especially hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, on which he published a great deal, and the properties of water and carbonic acid, which is simply carbon dioxide and water, that these were necessary and conducive to life. and perhaps something stronger. This is in Henderson's view. Their prevalence and typical properties were just what they needed to be conducive to life. Henderson, we might say 80 years later, was promoting an early example of what we've come to call the anthropic principle, that somehow the characteristics of the physical world are just what they need to be within a surprisingly narrow margin to the promotion of life and its evolutionary unfolding. For Henderson, this suggested a teleological principle was at work, and he actually talks about that later on. Oh goodness, I can't pay attention to that. While Whitehead may have been comfortable with such a suggestion, we know that he comes to view the divine element in our world and the eternal objects evident in all realizations in somewhat different terms. They also had in common the critique of vitalism, that it was far too content with a mechanistic view of the universe. They simply lay vitalism on top of that. And they both, equally different from different sources, criticized Herbert Spencer's extension of evolution in terms of competition. Perhaps most fruitfully, Henderson's more detailed biochemistry could have helped justify Whitehead's conviction that the principles underlying the physical sciences, instead of requiring some of nature's bifurcation, I'm misreading that line, instead of requiring some extra physical influence to engender life and consciousness, implying all the ills of nature's bifurcation, these physical principles, properly reconstrued, should be capable of bringing biological insights down into the physical realm. And the physical chemical realm would then seem fully capable of the emergence of living organisms, allowing him to think about how to think of these in the same frame. In the end, skip to this paragraph. In the lecture in which Whitehead opens, this is actually the first line in the lecture where he says, the key to nature is organism and not matter. He proceeds to argue that the organism is in itself an environmental concept. Apropos of environment and evolution, progress of the latter is essentially a problem of procuring a favorable environment. The advantage, he said, as the teaching term picked up again in January, the advantage of this point of view is that it admits of no jump whatever in principle between the living and the inanimate. Within the world of living organisms, natural selection depicts how the organism becomes fitted to its environment. But the environment will have been impacted as well, and in the physical chemical world, without access to the selection of the fitter generation by generation, it is in the fitness of the environment itself, in Haldane's phrase, which Whitehead seems to have found this kind of suggestion, found that suggestive. The point of an evolutionary philosophy is that the order of nature must be looked on as itself an emergent mode, having the processional, transitional character that, of course, he's looking for. That a processional, transitional character provides the outlook Whitehead favors will not surprise us, but in this transitional period of Whitehead's own philosophical development, I think we need to see how the point of this evolutionary philosophy provides a possible solution to the challenge he had set for himself in these lectures, at least as I read them, and keep in abeyance whether this had as yet developed into the objectives he later sets out for himself in Process and Reality. I'm trying to find ways, Brian, to jump through some of this, just as I get to the detail part. At the outset of this, as I've said in my introduction, Whitehead worries about the contrast between continuity and atomism. And in my reading of it, insists that the answer is not going to be to make a choice here, but it's going to be to find a blend and a balance. Balance is his word for those. Here now, several months later, in the beginning of January, when he's starting to explore these biological concepts, he pauses and says this, and I'll give you these two quotations. Trying to embed the order of nature in a more general metaphysical background, there are two ways of looking at nature which give you two rather extreme lines. Either your attention is caught by the enormous permanences, which make this the keynote of your thought, and make that the keynote of your thought, the mountains, the atoms, the electrons, ... The trouble for this metaphysics is time, and of course change. The alternative, he went on to suggest, is the idea of change. If the ultimate entity in its own essence is transition, both internally and externally, so it cannot be independent of the environment, all concrete things taken out of environment, after all, are abstractions. They're only concrete within their environment. If a man starts from change and is trying to be simply pluralistic, read atomistic, he must be in a muddle. The order of nature is for us, starting with this starting point, of such transitional ultimates that we have exactly the opposite difficulty. Rather, we are bothered by permanences. So if that's where Whitehead's going to start, how is he going to deal with the permanences? I mean, I want to fix on this, and in my longer paper, this is what I fix on, because he spells out now in that and the next 2 or 3 lectures how it is that if we start thinking about this interrelation between not only organisms such as we are or the societies we inhabit, but the molecules that make us up and ultimately the electrons themselves, which he insists over and over again need to be thought of as organisms, that there is a sense of a kind of evolutionary expansionism that is going to allow me to work from what we otherwise call the inanimate and up through the living and ultimately consciousness itself. I think that's the cue that gives him some confidence. He can go there and he can use this pathway to avoid bifurcation. Yeah, think about that.
It's good stuff. I'm sure there'll be really good questions, so I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to discuss.
Yeah. I'm going to skip those. I'll let you read that. This is the same quotation that Brian had. Interesting that we should land on the same one, which delineates exactly what I was saying, that he thinks he can actually articulate something about how electrons came to be so enormously stable, why they are the impressive permanences in the vastness of their number and in the vastness of their permanence, because they have developed in a way that produces, through their own influence, an environment that's conducive to their stability. Every organism is, in effect, working towards an environment that allows it to survive and become stable. And that's just as true at the inorganic level, so-called, as it becomes later in the organic level. So, an environment and the influence of an environment and the influence of participants on their environment, which is what Henderson opened up to, is what allows him to start exploring this possibility. So, 3 paragraphs and I'll finish. That's the case I'm trying to make with a little more detail than I will say orally here. But I want to say something about the overall implications of this for us. When first encountering these lectures in the philosophy of evolution, his phrase, I had thought they represented a stage along Whitehead's philosophical trajectory and expected to find indications of why he later rejected the idea of a philosophy of evolution in favor of a philosophy of organism. This would account for both the confidence with which he announces philosophy of organism and why we find him speaking so little about a philosophy of evolution hereafter. Instead, I've now come to understand his turning to these conceptions from the life sciences as more in tune with his conviction that we need not force a choice between temporal continuity and mechanical atomism, but must seek out some balance, some accommodation between them that substantiates them both. I don't see Whitehead as struggling to choose between a philosophy of organism and a philosophy of evolution, but turning to evolution as his way of framing an assumption capable of allowing him to avoid the bifurcation of nature. And the pathway to that resolution rests on the role of the environment, a pathway that opened up at this crucial juncture to him by Henderson. Whitehead felt the need, well, I have the last thing I can throw at you here. Whitehead felt the need in the midst of process and transition for stability, and came to see in the midst of these lectures, literally thinking this through as these lectures developed, that evolution towards stability is on the whole an evolution in which the modification of the environment is the important thing. And that the environment itself can be seen as an enduring and stability attaining organism which is being evolved. Evolutionary process, as far as we can observe it, takes place at an edge between two environments. What a wonderfully evocative phrase. That's my last page. As these lectures for his students resolve themselves into the Lowell lectures and then into Science in the Modern World, the call for a new philosophy of evolution becomes a philosophy of the evolution of organisms. No longer, it seems to me, a clarion call. It's not a very forceful, it's not so long, it's so longer a forceful claim. When it reasserts itself in PR, the term evolution has been dropped, and that seems puzzling. To remake it into a clarion call, did he simply simplify, drop out the one word so that he could hit a little harder philosophy of organism? The need for the systematic metaphysical analysis of actual occasion, actual events, and of societies, each organisms in their way, did it elbow aside the need to reassert the underlying evolutionary process? I don't know that we'll know the answer to that question. The only place in all of Process and Reality where Henderson gets a footnote is in the section on the order of nature, which is, of course, the title of his book. And many of the themes that we've explored here are echoed there, but they're only echoed there briefly. They're certainly not stated nearly as strongly. Whitehead is still saying things like the doctrine that every society requires a wide social environment leads to a distinction that a society may be more or less stabilized in reference to certain sorts of change in that environment. I'm hearing a lot of the same concepts at play here. There is even a recognition, at least the possibility, of cosmic epochs that are a result of this, but of course that doesn't get much play. Without the express notion of evolution, it has all become rather cautionary, at least where he's talking about Henderson's concepts. And it just doesn't seem like for Whitehead that's the center of his story anymore, as he shifts from one foot to the other.
So, about 11 minutes here. We've got Richard first and then Jason.
I thought I had timed it so well. Never happened to me before.
Yeah, right.
As I heard your lecture, which I appreciate deeply, and it spurred the thought that you referenced somewhat obliquely about Spencer, and I wrote down Spencer and Huxley and social Darwinism and racism and imperialism, which have been very dominant in the 20th century in the English Empire, the American Empire, other empires, and perhaps that pushed him to a philosophy of organism as the only way to avoid the unresolved issues of the title of Darwin's book, The Descent of Man and the Lesser Races.
I don't know, I didn't assess whether he was as directly worried about Darwin's wording of that, but he certainly was worried about Spencer's reading of that and where Spencer wanted to go with that.
Well,
was
and
so
we're-
concerned about it that I'm sure that is much of what encouraged him to embrace Henderson and a sense of mutualism that's actually hard to find in 20th century theoretical biology until the later decades of the 20th century when that comes to the fore.
Okay. Jason Lehman, Alyosha Helmet.
Thank you, Paul, and I really tremendously appreciated that, and especially the Roycean background. It looks like, and I haven't researched this extensively, but I know we've talked about it, that it's like it's in a way Whitehead is the child of this Roycean Jamesian context. It's the students of Royce and James who are the ones who are seeking out Whitehead to bring him to Harvard. But it seems here like there's something that Whitehead's talking about in this environment organism that's very similar to the way that pragmatists are thinking about activity and receptivity. So you have the German idealists who are all about effectivity, and you have the British empiricists who are all about affectivity. Is this primarily a passive mode or is this primarily an active mode? And it seems here that Whitehead and the pragmatists are playing with the idea of a reciprocal relation. And I don't think there's a lot of people in the world who are talking about this, but it seems to me that this might be the problem with the Darwinian mode of evolution is it's British empiricism. It's empiricism in the sense that all that these ideal processes are kind of a habitual heaping of things that happen to us without that attempt to describe active interests. So how to fit these two worlds together, German idealism and British empiricism, that seems to be the Harvard project and Husserl's project and also Whitehead's project. So anyways, I just thought I would leave that out there as a comment, let you respond to it.
One of the things we're already familiar with before coming to these lectures, but you can see nascent working towards insisting upon this interdependence, is Whitehead's concern about internal-external relations, which is widely debated in the philosophic world at the time. And of course, on the one side are the external relations, which is the only thing you've got if you read your empiricism as just the facts about things bumping into each other. The relational concern that we identify with Whitehead is a concern with external relations, a concern with internal relations, but he just doesn't want to let go of that other side. He's enough of a mathematical physicist and an empiricist, as he says himself in his own way, that he also wants to make it all clear to us, available to us, why that ends up being such an important and successful way to speak scientifically about the world. And so we end up finding him working out a kind of relationship between internal and external relations that you don't find in many other places, a few others, but not many others. It's actually a temporal relation, right? We're externally related with the past and internally related into our supertext and all that Jude's going to be talking about. So he has his own way of resolving that, but it certainly strikes me that he is well aware of the kind of debates that are swirling around at the time, certainly within the Aristotelian society and even more widely.
We've got Lehman, Alyosha Helmet, Olaf Jude.
Yeah, I have just a brief question. The first lecture here is dated 25th of September. You mentioned the pure Bergsonian lecture, which is 2 days earlier. What happened to that one? That's the first
There's a date.
There's a date issue. We've put the first one that was his inaugural lecture
Yeah,
that all the grandees attended,
right.
and presumably the one that was responded to as
Shepherd.
to Bergsonian.
Yeah, that was Sheffer.
That's the number one
That's it.
lecture
That's
there.
this
That's it,
Yeah.
yeah. Just that it was all recorded as being taking place on the wrong day.
But who, just so we're clear, whose
Well,
error?
that's in Lowe.
Whose error was it?
That's
Lowe's.
Lowe's.
Lowe's error.
Lowe's error.
Lowe's.
Okay.
All right.
Alyosha, I'm sorry, did you want to
That
follow?
was it.
Alyosha and then Helmet,
Yeah.
Olaf Jude.
I wanted
I
to.
didn't expect nearly so easy an answer for the question.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question concerning the impact of the strategic direction Whitehead takes from this notion of evolution, because I think what you also hinted at, I think, is that he doesn't really become a proponent of evolution theory or of the biological notion of organism, but you might actually say, I think, that he moved into the opposite direction. In Function of Reason, he says that the concept of evolution viewed in abstraction is so obvious that he marveled that anybody could possibly oppose it, but he says that this reduction he sees on the Darwinian side of doing things sort of put him off this strict notion of evolution. And taking in addition to that his notion of nature, that in concept of nature, he not only takes the title to be nature, but he also considers himself explicitly a Naturphilosoph with a German notion. He later drops that notion completely. I mean, he sort of gets rid of the notion of nature to the most possible degree. He incorporates evolution as basically a self-evident system without then lingering on the biological implications of that. And he seems to, he mentions environment in exactly the same point, Function of Reason, where he says there is an environment every organism interacts with, but later on in Process and Reality, he doesn't talk about environment really. He talks about, and then is it a question of relation? Is the extensive continuum really the environment he talked about before? Is this mention of foreground, background, he uses sort of an equivalent to that, but wouldn't you say that his dealing with these notions of organism and concept of evolution, again, like we said before this morning, is to a certain degree a misappropriation of this biological strain in order to get a very much broader metaphysical point that really tries to avoid the pitfalls of being too specific about its own application?
Too many things to say about that. Just off the surface first, the kind of things that Henderson was publishing and that were around at the time were all things that were coming out just after World War I. Bateson and Haldanes and others were starting to move with Mendelian genetics over on their side of the street, or whichever building they were in at the time. But as we know, as the academic interest in these areas develops, there is a grand synthesis in theoretical biology that pulls Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution together, and at least in the first instance is very much exploited in a reductive way. Well, that's just happening in the late 20s and 30s. That's when the grand synthesis is really coming together, and then of course everybody starts to lose attention during the 40s for a while, and that's what they pick up again in the 50s. So there's a moving beyond the notion of a grand synthesis in theoretical biology in a way that is now open once again to not so quite drastically a reductive approach, that is willing to consider mutualism and not just competition. Those are all things that start coming out again in the 70s and 80s. Just as philosophers are thinking that the philosophy of biology is not going to be reducible to physics, right? Biologists are starting to discover that, philosophers are starting to rediscover that. So part of an answer to your question, I think, is at this sociological, superficial level, that he's well enough aware of the despite descriptions of him to the contrary, I think he's well enough aware of what the atmosphere of discussion in those areas was like. And there just is no longer as conducive an atmosphere in which to consider evolution in these philosophical ways as there even had been 20 or 30 years before. If you pick and choose which ones you're going to, you leave Spencer and some guys aside, and you emphasize Henderson, there was an atmosphere that was going to be conducive to them. I think there's one other consideration I'll mention. In some sense, just where he was in that historical train, and whether that atmosphere makes a difference, is one kind of consideration, but it's also something we can just nail together with some historical facts. much less easy to put together, or it has been much less easier for me, despite how Joe Pettit is behaving over here, is that in the sections of the lectures where he's talking about this, in the sections of PR where the only place he ever mentions Henderson is when he has paused from the grand structure of metaphysics and has talked about the order of nature. I mean, we haven't said much yet. I don't know if there'll be much opportunity to talk about what's Whitehead doing when he's talking about the order of nature, when he's talking about cosmology, as opposed to when he's doing metaphysics full steam. Because it seems to me metaphysics full steam is what brings us the ontological principles and the categories and the grand PR structure. But if we step back, you have to step back from that to get Whitehead to give us a little more, not quite so abstracted a description of the world we find ourselves in, at least in this epoch, right? There's a sense in which metaphysics is going to extend beyond the cosmic epochal shifts that may be going on. But when he talks about evolution in these early lectures, he's really talking about what do we find in the world of nature now? What's the order of nature now? That's kind of the realm that Henderson from biology lifted up to, and it's kind of the descriptive metaphysics that Whitehead, not critical nor speculative, but a kind of descriptive metaphysics of the order of nature we find ourselves in. I mean, that's not where his attention is in PR, by and large. And it seems to me that's one of the reasons why he's willing to carry over the concept of organism into the full-bore metaphysics, although he articulates it largely in other terms. But evolution is really a descriptive feature of the order of nature we find ourselves in.
You're hard to stop once you get going.
Lecture for 40 years.
I'm sorry, I won't be able to get to the others, but the two presentations that you'll find are very similar, and
Lectures are ex cathedra.
This can sort of go into the next round of questions. But now we have our second presentation. Dennis Sölch, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Heinrich Heine Universität in Düsseldorf, Executive Director and Vice President of the German Whitehead Society. In 2016, he was a William James Scholar in Residence at the William James Center in Potsdam, Germany, and held visiting professorships in Finland and Austria. And Dennis has authored and edited 3 books on Whitehead, including a translation of Whitehead's The Aims of Education into German, and a number of different articles. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. My jet lag allowed me to prepare a PowerPoint presentation, which might be quite helpful. Apart from that, I agree with almost everything that Paul already said. So I'm just gonna flesh it out by approaching basically the same topic from a slightly different historical perspective. Let me start by looking at process metaphysics or process philosophy from a very general perspective, because process metaphysics is, or has come to be, a very ambiguous term. On the one hand, it refers to a general tendency within the history of Western metaphysics, so basically refers to all concepts that give change priority over substantiality, while on the other hand, it tends to refer to Whitehead's metaphysics only, or to Whitehead's metaphysics and the metaphysics of Whitehead's followers. And as such, it has been quite fruitful, or fruitfully applied, both in prose or in analytic philosophy especially, but also in continental philosophy, in the form of process ontologies that have been developed leaning on Whitehead, and on the other hand, by applying the concept of process to individual sciences, both in the natural sciences and the humanities. And that has given rise to something we might actually call a processual turn. And you will find a number of individual sciences with a process label. If you just have a brief look or a quick glance at the relevant literature, you will find process physics, process linguistics, process theology, process psychology, and a lot of other you want to say process aesthetics, and a number of other process-labeled sciences. And probably the most fruitful over the past years has been process biology. But if we take that scheme, it seems that process biology is merely an application of heuristic concepts derived from Whitehead. Whereas I would agree with Paul that we basically, if we look back at development or the genesis of Whiteheadian process metaphysics, biology already plays a very important role, and we might even at least there is some possibility to say that there were processual developments within theoretical biology before we had process metaphysics as the Whiteheadian system in the first place. So I'm going to have, or to take a historical perspective and see in how far those processual tendencies within theoretical biology were already important or relevant for Whitehead or for the emergence of Whitehead's metaphysics. And I also agree that there is a lot of evidence apart from aspects that Whitehead explicitly mentions, for example, the references that other contemporary biologists made to Whitehead's works. So Haldane, for example, referred to Whitehead as somebody who was contributing to theoretical biology. And I think the lecture notes on the philosophical presuppositions of science give further evidence for the influence of biology on the development of Whitehead's philosophy. So according to Louis Heath, for example, Whitehead referred to the modern era of science as the biological age. While not explicitly discussing questions of biology as such, his references to the growing relevance of biology for philosophy occur at certain crucial junctures within his lectures, and they are too succinct and too emphatic to be just discarded as mere niceties to his colleagues. So I think a detailed assessment of the first volume of the critical edition promises to shed light on the extent to which Whitehead was indebted to biology and the biologists of his time. So if we look at the outcome of the lectures in the form of Science and the Modern World, published in 1925, we find a reconstruction of the development of the European sciences over the past 500 years. But the chief value of Science and the Modern World certainly does not lie in its contribution to the history or the philosophy of science. Whitehead's rough classifications provide an interesting, but nevertheless quite superficial idea of crucial developments. In contrast, the great merit of Science and the Modern World consists in the endeavor to explicate the metaphysical assumptions hovering in the background of all the scientific theories of a given period. So its object is not science, but the implicit presuppositions of each scientific outlook dominant during a particular historical epoch. Crucially, the implicit presuppositions of all the dominant scientific outlooks since the 17th century rest on the same kind of abstractions, namely the idea of matter as a passive bearer of properties, including the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and the idea that matter can unequivocally be defined by reference to a particular location in space and time. So the natural sciences in general, on this analysis, are pervaded by the fallacy of simple location, because they all take for granted the abstractions at work in classical physics. Now, I think the Harvard lectures on the philosophical presuppositions of science spell out many of the details that are lost in the sort of grand view of Science and the Modern World. They lack almost completely that narrative structure that makes Science and the Modern World such a nice piece of literature. And instead, they come right to the heart of the matter. So the philosophical criticism of abstractions here is first and foremost concerned with the search for coherence. That's why it's called the philosophical presuppositions. The metaphysical task pursued in the lectures aims at the unity of the objective world, underlying the pluralism of phenomena and divergent theoretical descriptions. allowing us to understand conceptual abstractions as abstractions from one and the same universe. So he doesn't want to accept the pluralism. But the philosophical presuppositions of science are also shown to be highly relevant for science itself. The argument unfolded through many of the lectures in the first half of the course is that physics has reached a dead end. Its further progress seems to be restricted to details and minor problems, while the theoretical foundation shakes and rattles, to also use Emerson's phrasing, in the face of irreconcilable data and conflicting interpretations. And these dilemmas, Whitehead indicates, might hopefully be overcome by a philosophical modification of the underlying paradigmatic assumptions of physics. And he himself gives two examples of those dilemmas that physics has encountered. The first dilemma encountered by physics is having to explain the equal validity of two conflicting theories of light. Falling down. In the context of quantum theory, the corpuscular theory of light and wave theory appear to be equally feasible. Whitehead remarks that the state of science over the past 40 years has hardly changed. We have to use, that's what he says, slightly different phrasing, the state of science has hardly changed over the past 40 years. We have to use the wave theory on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, even the corpuscular theory for Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And as long as there is no unifying theory which would allow us to decide in advance when to use which theoretical approach, physics has to cope with a degree of contingency that obstructs further progress. And the second obstacle that physics encounters, Whitehead indicates, is due to the habit of thinking of the electron as much more concrete than it really is. An electron is treated as a subatomic particle, while at the same time nothing can be measured but electric charge extending over a field. So think of Whitehead working on Maxwell. Bell explicitly puts into quotation marks Whitehead's comment that instead of an electronic particle, all he sees is a little spot of mist. Regarding an electron as a corpuscular entity means making the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So he says, all you really want of the electron is a sort of structural or imposed character with a focal center in the sphere we call the electron. That type of vibration with that focal location. Electrons would be then highly abstract in relation to the concrete fact of the electromagnetic field. So the dilemma is that on the one hand, an electron may be considered as a particle with an extension in space, even though this extension might be minute. And on the other hand, it is a structured field with a focal center and very blurry edges. So physics, as Whitehead makes clear, is entangled in problems that it cannot seem to solve, because any possible solution would hinge on the same paradigms that have caused the problem in the first place. And science in the modern world here is very diplomatic in saying that the progress in science has now reached a turning point, with the stable foundations of physics breaking up. And I think the Harvard lectures show a much more straightforward embrace of biology as the science with the greatest prospect for radical innovations, and biology as the one science where physics can find helpful instructions for a paradigm change. So he says, the next great advance in physics is to be made in the realm of biology. And Bell here has underlined the word great, which probably indicates the emphasis of Whitehead's words in the lecture. The sentence very much sounds like a prophecy. So what is more, biology is expected to both entangle itself from the presuppositions paradigmatic in classical physics, and in turn to contribute to a re-evaluation and modification of the foundational concepts in physics itself. Now, as you already mentioned, Whitehead wasn't the first to observe the increasing importance of biology. The time when he was beginning to teach at Harvard coincides with the culmination of a development that had been going on for almost a century. At its core lay the question as to the nature of life, with reductive materialism or mechanicism on the one hand, and vitalism on the other hand, as the two explanatory paradigms. It all, according to Whitehead at least, begins with Descartes' separation of a body, characterized by its mere physical extension in space, from an active and living mind. As a distinctly biological theory, mechanicism gained momentum in the early 19th century with authors like Helmholtz, Schleiden, and Dubois-Reymond seeking to replace mystical explanations of physiological activity by recourse to the principles of mathematical physics. And of course, there was some undeniable progress in measurement and classification afforded by the early mechanist school. And yet, the underlying philosophy was quite naive. So, for example, Dubois-Reymond, in his study on the limitations of understanding nature, in his book Über die Grenzen des Naturerkennens, he insisted that scientific explanations consist in reducing all changes in the world of living bodies to the movement of atoms. So in breaking up natural processes into a mechanism of atoms. Mechanics seem to involve the same apodictic certainty as mathematics, requiring nothing more of a causal explanation than describing the effects of the potential and the kinetic energy of atoms in organic bodies. So that's not just a straw man that vitalism or even Whitehead argued against, but that was a philosophy or a philosophical position that people actually championed. Vitalism had evolved as a counter-movement to reductive materialism, and it was quite successful in pointing out some of the flaws of mechanistic interpretations of life, but it failed to offer a convincing alternative that could be scientifically utilized. Driesch, for instance, repudiated the idea that an organized system can be understood as a bottom-up composition. Mechanicist accounts are unable to give adequate explanations of self-regulation or psychic phenomena, but the alternative, as far as Driesch is concerned, was to understand biological processes as dependent on an ordered system as the condition for self-sustaining processes. And his notion of the neo-Aristotelian entelechie was to account for the existence of an ordered whole, but in fact that amounts to a mere postulation of the fact that the biological system precedes biochemical activities in living organisms. So it says we have to understand biological processes as part of a whole, but the existence of that particular whole is basically explained by reference to an abstract metaphysical principle. Or think of Elridge's organizatory factors, which is something very similar. So Driesch's approach failed to offer a substantial alternative to mechanicism, but it helped to pave the way for a third paradigm, a third conception beyond the dichotomy of reductive materialism and vitalism, namely organicism. From the organicist perspective, the relation between an organism and its environment is to be distinguished from the mere dialectic of action and reaction. So it's neither a bottom-up nor a top-down approach, but it's an interactive concept. So the continuous succession of biological and biochemical processes have the character of an intimate coordination, which serves to maintain the organic structure as a whole. Activity and structure cannot be separated because the coordinated plurality of phenomena in a biological structure only makes sense when considered in relation to a persisting whole. And one of the earliest statements that explicitly comment on the paradigm change in our understanding of nature was made by John Scott Haldane, who already in 1908 predicted that a meeting point between biology and physical science may at some time be found. There is no reason for doubting. But we may confidently predict that when that meeting point is found and one of the two sciences is swallowed up, that one will not be biology. So the growing independence of biology from physics and chemistry was a well-known and often discussed topic in scientific discourses. And and Haldane's son, John Burden Sanderson Haldane, who later became mainly known as one of the founders of population genetics, made a similar announcement just 1 year before Whitehead's Harvard course. In his famous essay Daedalus, to which Whitehead refers his students, the younger Haldane declares biology to be the science of the future. He says the chief value of physics and chemistry for the next generations will almost exclusively be on of an industrial and commercial nature, the effect of their respective research primarily a quantitative advance. Biology, however, would provide revolutionary breakthroughs, for example, in experimental genetics. The younger Haldane is no less dramatic in his choice of words than his father, speaking of the invasion and destruction of mathematical physics by physiology. Yet, in his Daedalus, he also suggests that the basic metaphysical working hypothesis of science and practical life will be something like Bergsonian activism. And Whitehead felt it necessary to mention that Haldane the elder commented on his son's book that it was full of bad physiology. And I think Whitehead believed. And he also refers his students to Russell's Icarus, which basically takes a more political perspective, but as far as biology is concerned, says Haldane here is completely right, and I agree with him. So the rise in importance of biology was a commonplace in the early 20th century. Yet few went as far as the Haldanes in seeing physics swallowed up by biology, and hardly anybody would even think of spelling out what physics might look like when digested by biology, or maybe rather when cooked after a recipe written in biological vocabulary. And Whitehead is the exception, and the Harvard lectures provide a look into the laboratory in which the attempt was being made to put physics on a new foundation. What happens when the historical relationship between physics and biology is reversed and biological concepts are imaginatively generalized in such a way so as to include physical notions? More precisely, which concepts are both essential for the nature of life, as studied by biology, and transferable to inorganic nature? How far can the intimately coordinate relation of whole and part, of organism and environment, be applied to physical phenomena? These questions give an outline of the program of Whitehead's Harvard lectures and pave the way for his later philosophy of organism. But the whole question is, what is the ultimate idea? That's one of the difficulties with quoting when there are not full grammatically correct sentences. Enormous bearing on the perennial battle between mechanism and vitalism. Whole conglomeration, the body, to be looked on as simple aggregate of bits of matter. With organism idea, you've got a new situation entirely. Simply another exhibition of organism you get in molecule, and from there to electron. It's working his way downward into the smaller bits of matter as perceived by physics. A comprehensive metaphysical theory that allows for an understanding of both physics and biology as governed by the same paradigm would not only put an end to the struggle between vitalism and mechanicism in biology, but would open up new vistas for theoretical physics as well. Now, I agree, triggered by his reading of Lawrence Henderson's Fitness of the Environment, Whitehead attempts to integrate the concept of an organism's environment into physical theory. He insists that there is no inherent contradiction between the concreteness of a finite emergent entity and the conditioning of the same emergence by its environment. The morphological or structural identity of an individual entity need not be thought of as independent from and prior to its embeddedness in a particular set of organized circumstances. In contrast, unity becomes meaningless if divorced from a background against which it appears as a unity. Every limitation is at the same time a self-transcendence in the sense that each limit presupposes the limitation of something against the background of something else, making the notion of an individual entity compatible with and dependent on the very individual's environment. So unity in something more than itself is exactly what you're always talking about. the environment in turn can also no longer be thought of as given or fixed, so that an individual organism could be well said to be well adapted or not. And as you have already quoted, each organism to some extent creates its own environment. Throughout its previous existence, it has left a mark on its environment in a way that contributes to its own future survival. Organism and environment thus have a tendency to stabilize each other. And this, for Whitehead, is a crucial insight to be translated into physics in order to avoid the fallacy of simple location implicit in the scientific study of nature so far. So, I think you already had that on the screen, how to account for enormous stability of electrons, etc., and for evolution of things in this order of nature, Whitehead says by survival of fittest. You go back to where, within order of nature, you have fitful stretches of emergent enduring entities. We finally got an order of nature dominated by those entities, which created an environment favorable not only to themselves, but to production of other entities of same kind, an environment that is created by a society of entities producing an environment favorable but to existence of them all. Environment has evolved as an environment which secures selection of definite types. The plasticity of the environment is the key to the evolutionary problem and that of permanence. And here I think you can clearly see what you already mentioned, that there is no conflict between a philosophy of evolution and a philosophy of organism, but the concept of organism for Whitehead is essential to a theory of evolution. Yeah, that's where I'm coming to the end. The result is a view on physics that at least promises to overcome the dilemmas already mentioned. An electron would no longer have to be described in terms of a corpuscular individual entity, but as a particular modification of an environment. An object is really everywhere. If you simply take electrons and atoms in billiard ball view, the electron is its field and nothing else. There's a nucleus, of course, but location, that's the problem with the scribbled notes. Electron rather loses its sense. You can't disjoin it from its field. To conclude, in science and the modern world, the discussion of the environment is limited to a couple of pages in chapter 6. In the 19th century, which is the title of chapter 6, but the small space dedicated to the topic should not be seen as indicating small importance. The givenness of the environment, Whitehead says here, dominates everything. And in the Harvard lectures, the interconnected concepts of organism and environment and evolution pervade the entire course, illustrating the challenging task of putting physics on a biological foundation. And I think the first volume of the critical edition has underlined the impact of theoretical biology on Whitehead's metaphysics before the philosophy of organism as such is worked out. So in a way, I completely agree with you, and I think that here the critical edition is pretty important because it stresses the dominance of theoretical biology and the concepts of biology for physics, and thus in a way point at a particular development within Whitehead's thought.
This stuff is great. This is great. We got about 16 minutes. Is it Stan? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. In your paragraph on vitalism, you have the following sentence. Mechanistic accounts are unable to give adequate explanations of self-regulation in embryonic structures or psychic phenomena. That word psychic phenomena, which is of course relevant to physics too, is that something that Whitehead talks about ever, other than places like this? Because that's very controversial. That's why I bring it up.
Yes, well, you have the discussion of the notion of consciousness, which basically is another way of saying psychic phenomena.
No. Psychic phenomena is, recognition, telepathy, clairvoyance. It's a very clear word.
Okay.
Phenomena. Consciousness.
No, then my apologies. That is simply due to my lack
I see.
of
Okay.
because I'm not a native speaker.
Okay.
I
Because
didn't want to
Henry
say psychic in the sense of paranormal or
Psychological.
Griffin- Thank you. Okay.
Helmut, and then
But
Bill.
if you allow me to make a quick note simply to both the excellent papers by Paul and Dennis, I think referring and to the first volume, of course, putting that together, I think mentioning Haldane, mentioning of course Henderson and so on, calls for something like a supplement, which, if I may say so, Michael Hampe and I have done in German, meaning showing these original texts for future studies. Because otherwise, Paul, you would have, again, like your paper, even to extend it, to explain, you know, the whole concept of order of nature in Henderson, and then showing again how it's reflected in Whitehead, because he, as you said, only mentions Henderson once. But once you see the text by Henderson, for example, it becomes very clear how strong his influence was. And something else, of course, applies during his London times. Whitehead was taking part in the weekly discussions of Aristotelian society, when Percy Nunn was there, who influenced him to a great extent on what education should be. So you can link Whitehead's ideas of education to this part. The question of the relationship to Bergson. Part of the Aristotelian society was Wilton Carr, who was the translator of Bergson into English at that point. Mm-hmm. So he has there a kind of almost direct influence of Bergson. Simply to put it together, I'm wondering whether the American community would be interested to do something like that, and it would really fit neatly into the first and other volumes to see the philosophical and historical background of what Whitehead is referring to in his lectures. Alexander, of course, another person, and Bradley. I'm not just listing everything, but that would be, I think, an interesting point of encouraging further Whitehead studies and putting him into the philosophical, biological background of his time.
I think you can even extend that to influences or potential influences on Whitehead, which would, for example, also include Wheeler and Woodgard, and so other authors that, for example, Dorothy Emmett mentions as relevant for any discussion on Whitehead's philosophy of organism. And on the other hand, the impact or texts that where you can see the impact of Whitehead, especially in the domain of theoretical biology. So Haldane, for example, in his later works, the philosophy of a biologist, for example, his later works are basically a discussion of the paradigm of organism and the relevance of such an organism paradigm for several problems within biology. And then on a couple of pages he refers to Whitehead and says, well, that was Whitehead's approach. And Whitehead's approach is consistent with what I'm about to do here. There are just some flaws within Whitehead. For example, I doubt whether you can really discuss an organism separated from its environment, which is a reference to the theory of prehensions. And there you see where sort of the metaphysical perspective and the biological perspective diverge. But Whitehead and Whitehead's philosophy are seen as contributions to discussions within theoretical biology. So if you're thinking of a sort of wider context that would flesh out some of what some of the arguments and concepts in Whitehead, that would basically, on the one hand, include texts and concepts before the publication of Whitehead's work, and texts that were influenced by Whitehead in places where you wouldn't normally expect that.
I'm sorry, Bill, and then George. I'm sorry, Bill, I didn't realize you were going to want to refer to that passage.
wanted to refer to that last passage that Dennis had up. Because I found the discussion of the electron fascinating, and so that passage starts off by saying an object is everywhere, if I recall. So, if I understand correctly, Whitehead is saying that the mistake of that empiricist tradition and the mechanistic tradition more broadly is to conceive of things as self-contained entities. So the electron is a thing independent of without internal relations.
In a particular place.
In a particular place,
time.
right.
Yeah, simple
But in
as-
fact, the electron is its field.
Is a field, yeah.
So implying those internal relations to the environment. So the effect anything has spreads throughout.
That's the difference between a field and Whitehead's concept that atomic occasions generate fields. It's a different concept. And it's a set sense of the interaction that is central here.
So is the field a history as well? But there's what? There are the influence of an entity on its environment and the environment on the entity. And then over time, that creates what?
There are three fields that Whitehead talked about. The causal field, which is the confluence of antecedent events which generate an atomic occasion. And then there are the field of events which are generated in confluence with other events by that entity. And then there is also the contemporary world where there are causal relations of independence. Those are three types of field. And the thing where Whitehead's philosophy of organism differs, in my judgment, very sharply from pragmatism is the fact that to really understand the universe and its evolution, you have to understand the intersection of fields.
Did you want to respond, Dennis, before I go to George?
Yes, just to add to that, we're not yet talking about the philosophy of organism as outlined in Process and Reality, but here Whitehead is talking as as a philosopher of science who looks at phenomena in physics. So the notion of field here is explicitly that of an electronic field. Yeah, exactly. And just says within, you have different concepts or notions of an electron. They are relevant in different concepts or in different theories. And what is lacking here is consistency or a coherent notion that does justice to the phenomenon, that's adequate, and at the same time can be consistently applied to all the phenomena and all the theoretical approaches in question.
George?
Timing is everything. And whether for Whitehead or in order to do what Whitehead is trying to do, you have to have a rigorous, well-founded scientific alternative to mathematical physics, from which to draw metaphors and analogies, and on which to rely for an alternative grounding description of physical phenomena. So this critique you beautifully describe of physics, find that in Hegel's Science of Logic, very explicitly. But he has no biology or no understanding of nature quite yet that he can rely on as an alternative, though he tries to forge one himself. Chemism and chemical explanations, teleology does logically live in the category of life as a part of ontology, a philosophy of organism, but it's not one that is able to withstand a critique of mechanism and Newtonian-based mathematical physics at the time. Whereas by Whitehead's century later, he's perfectly poised to have this conversation as to Helmut's suggestion that what we need is the integrative materials, the backgrounds of Whitehead was working, So in 1983, I wrote that book. It's called The Modern Origins of Process Thought. And it has all of that literature and all of those people and all of these issues lined up with each other to show how.
We put these texts together, that's the difference, what I was referring to. You
Yeah.
add Paul Dane, you have
Yeah.
McTaggart, you
Yeah.
have
They're all
the
together.
original text, you did a summary.
Yes. Unfortunately, they're same kind of problem as Hegel had, timing. That in that period of time, no one outside of the Whiteheadian community was interested in Whitehead at all. And inside the Whitehead community, nobody was interested in this kind of wider context of conversation.
But except
They
the
treated
Germans.
sui generis. Well, not in 1983. Yeah.
I think what you're bringing here was a point I wanted to suggest also. But it's very interesting to hear the history, the historical context in which a Whitehead's concept of organism developed, and protest against bifurcation of nature, which in my judgment evolved more into the interaction of mental and physical phenomena. I can't help but think if Whitehead was doing that, forming these novel concepts of integration and interaction in the context of this historical, we may have a little more Hegelian type of situation in this respect. The way in which the human community is interacting with the environment, it's not creating a very favorable environment.
That's what I was thinking of during the call.
It's threatening the survival
Absolutely.
of humanity. And what are the values also that are leading to that degeneration of hope and the degeneration of the advance of civilization? On the other hand, also, we have the emergence of precision medicine, where it's not chance that's instigating in the evolution, but deeper genetic understanding, where human beings are able to manipulate genes, influence genes, and create evolutionary changes within organisms. But the general phenomenon is one of interaction of entities with one another, which actually applies cosmologically, not only to complex organic.
Well, I'm still stuck on the intellectual environment and the fields interacting there. Now, I think Helen is absolutely right. You would address these questions or find the resources for them in this wonderful community of discourse that has grown up over the last 20 or 30 years on Whitehead from, frankly, people much more better grounded than English and even American scholars were in the history of philosophy, so that they would sort of presuppose a knowledge of these other kinds of, from Hans Driesch to Hegel to you name it, we'll know these figures. Whether we're interested in Lutze in 1983 is another matter, but certainly we know who he is and what he has done and what his contributions are, and if someone merely suggests it, it falls on a fertile soil that we just didn't have.
What'll be interesting to find out is whether or not this is the right time for it to be reintroduced or not. And there's some evidence that it is, and some evidence that I would say that it's not. So there's this volume coming out by John Dupre at Exeter from Oxford, in which he says, I do not want to be associated with Whitehead.
Whitehead, yes.
And then goes on to, Altman admits he has not read it, but then goes on to levy substantive criticisms based on having not read it. That are just the tropes from the middle of the 20th century. But that said, he is a respected leader within modern philosophy of biology and is explicitly defending a process ontology biology position. So I'm hoping that the work you're doing and that you're doing will show them that they're making a mistake in thinking they can just dismiss it. But so it worries me that once again we're sort of at the right time, wrong time. Time will tell.
Let me just add to that. I sometimes get the feeling that modern process biology wants to reinvent the wheel. Most of it has already been there, it's just been skipped. And if you went back to Henderson and others, time and then to Whitehead, you would see that many of the fundamental conceptions that we want to reintroduce now have already been there. Of
Skipped
course, you
and
now have-
denigrated, you might say, by a community who at the time, this is the community which is being refuted by this work, but they are, they have a kind of hegemonic power and have denigrated this material as being fuzzy-minded, romantic, philosophically unworthy stuff, when in fact it's cutting-edge philosophy of the future that, under a different set of circumstances, historical circumstances, can prevail.
I want to let George Allen get in, and then Helmut will get the last word.
One of the persons who's done some serious work on this is Suzanne Langer. Let us not forget her. She's concerned to try to give a grounding in mind, to try to give a grounding in the biological and biological psychology and some degrees anthropology studies. She quotes them in detail, and in some cases, people who think they're being reductive aren't, as she interprets them and whatnot, using all of this to give a scientific grounding to her claims about, the notion of the act and whatnot. So she's got a metaphysical notion that's Whiteheadian, that's rooted in science. It's out-of-date science now, but it's a wonderful example of the kind of thorough work that must be done to get anywhere on this.
That 1983 book I mentioned featured Susan Langer. It was dedicated to her.
Excuse me?
Your Helmut?
Well, just a personal note to John Dupré. He happened to be present when we founded the British Whitehead Society. And he publicly said, my whole undertaking, if you like, is in structure and in content very Whiteheadian. At the same time, if I would claim that, write that, it would create for me difficulties in my community.
Yeah.
So you have this very split, and I mean that's from his own mouth. No, I'm not making it up.
So he protests too much.
Yeah. So it's Dupré, if you look at it, is very Whiteheadian, but you will not find Whitehead being mentioned. At the same time, you can see that he is a member of the
And I don't
British
have
Whitehead Society.
too much problem with that. I just wish he wouldn't then say, I don't want to be affiliated with Whitehead, and then repeat a whole bunch of stuff that's really sophomoric, right?
So is that written by him, or is it by somebody who wrote
Yeah.
it?
No, he doesn't.
Yeah, and I've tried to confront him with it, but he's just, I know the political reasons, and I can be sympathetic to a degree, but then don't just repeat nonsense is the frustrating part. It is just these really sad sort of objections. Actually, I should let Dennis get the last comment in his session, then we'll go to lunch.
That comes as a surprise, but lunch is always a good notion to end the talk, isn't it? So no, thank you very much for your questions, and I'm at least looking forward to asking you a couple of questions during lunch break. That's why I'm also looking forward to lunch break.
Excellent. So we'll be back in an hour and a half.
Yeah, he was